Hello, my name is Kyle Calzadias, and today I will be talking about substance dualism, which is one of the most influential theories in philosophy of mind, in my opinion. Substance dualism is the view that the mind and the body are two fundamentally different kinds of substances. According to this theory, the body is physical, extended in space, and governed by physical laws, while the mind is non-physical and responsible for thinking, reasoning, feeling, and conscious experience as we know it. I chose substance dualism because it directly addresses questions that I feel are personal and are very useful. One being, are we more than just our brains? Another being, is consciousness something physical or is it fundamentally different from matter? Questions like these in particular are still debated in today's neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, even with today's advancements in modern technology. Now, substance dualism has a long philosophical history, but most famously, it is thought of when brought up by René Descartes, a 17th century philosopher who often is considered to be one of the most prevalent philosophers of modern philosophy. Descartes' ideas continue to shape how we think about consciousness, identity, and mental experience, even though many philosophers today reject his conclusions. In this podcast, I will explain substance dualism as it appears often in our course, focusing on Descartes' meditations. Then I will look at 3 outside sources, primarily to show how philosophers today challenge the old idea of dualism. Finally, I will end with a general discussion where I reflect on what I found convincing, confusing, and valuable about substance dualism. To start, in our course, substance dualism is presented mainly through Descartes' meditations. Descartes begins his project by doubting everything that could possibly be doubted, including his senses, the external world, and even his own body. However, one thing he notices that cannot be doubted is the fact that he is indeed thinking. This leads to his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," which we could get from this. Descartes is essentially saying that he is a thinking thing. The mind's defining feature is thoughts and being able to understand things. Now, for Descartes, he then contrasts the mind with the body, which he calls an extended thing. What he is talking about here is the body exists in space and follows all the mechanical laws, while the mind, on the other hand, is a non-physical being that Descartes argues because he can clearly and distinctly think of his mind without the outside body. The two must be two separate substances. One of Descartes' most important arguments on this is about the mind existing without the body. Then the mind must be capable of existing independently, which supports substance dualism. However, Descartes also believes that the mind and body interact. Mental decisions cause physical movements, and bodily sensations cause mental experiences. He famously suggests that the pineal gland is where this interaction takes place, creating what later philosophers call as the interaction problem, which is about how can a non-physical mind casually interact with the body. Even though Descartes' explanation was widely criticized, the framework for his argument defines the mind and body problem and truly sets the stage for modern philosophy. The first outside source I want to take a look at is by Keith Frankish, an article titled "The Lure of the Cartesian Sideshow." This article is interesting because Frankish strongly criticizes substance dualism, and he argues that it is psychology appealing without philosophy. I'm sorry, I read the wrong point there. Frankish claims that what people are drawn to is dualism because consciousness feels mysterious and separate from the physical world, saying that our subjective experiences like pain, emotions, and our inner thoughts do not feel like physical processes, making them tempting to assume that they must be non-physical. However, Frankish actually argues that this is intuition does not justify substance dualism. He suggests that dualism creates an unnecessary metaphysical complexity that distracts us from being able to better develop the physical explanations of consciousness. To go even further, according to Frankish, just because we do not fully understand how the brain produces consciousness does not mean consciousness is non-physical. I found this to be particularly interesting, especially with his claim that dualism often feels like an explanatory gap rather than solving them. However, this view can feel unsatisfying because it does downplay the reality of subjective experience, which is one of the main reasons dualism feels this way in the first place. Now, the next source I want to look at is from Patricia Churchland, who is a major and prominent figure within the neuroscience space. In her work, Churchland mentions and argues that substance dualism is incompatible with modern neuroscience. She also points out that due to specific brain regions that when damage to certain of these brain regions there is consistent alters in personality, memory, and emotions when there has been damage to the specific regions in the brain, suggesting that mental states are deeply dependent on the physical brain, not this non-physical form of the mind. Also, from her perspective, dualism struggles to explain why changes to the brain are so reliably made. She also criticizes that the interaction problem, arguing that there is no science to back up the fact that non-physical forces are acting on the brain. Churchland truly believes that as neuroscience advances with technology, the idea of the non-physical mind will become unnecessary, almost like an outdated scientific theory that has been misproven due to the new technology. And honestly, I agree with Churchland's emphasis here, as her arguments make it difficult to maintain a strict substance dualism acceptance with the advancements that we've had in modern technology and science. However, her approach does risk reducing consciousness to purely a mechanical process, which I feel for some people really fails to capture what the subjective experience is actually like. Now, for my final outside source, I looked at David Chambers, who does not defend the Cartesian dualism, but is sympathetic to some dualist concerns. Chambers is known for distinguishing between easy problems of consciousness, such as experiencing behaviors and neural processes, and the hard problem, which is explaining why physical processes give these reasons, why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. Chambers goes on to argue that physical explanations alone may not fully account for consciousness. While he does not endorse substance dualism outright, he does suggest that consciousness may require something beyond just the standard physical explanation. After looking at Chambers' points, I did find his position to be interesting because it does take consciousness seriously without fully committing to Descartes' framework. His work shows why substance dualism continues to be discussed, even if many philosophers reject his oldest and biggest and some of his strongest claims. Now, I would like to have a general discussion about this task. So, in starting this final section, I would like to take a bit more time to reflect more freely on substance dualism and what I found challenging or valuable about it. To start, one thing I found confusing is how substance dualism explains interaction without violating physical laws. Descartes' answers feel almost outdated, and modern dualists struggle to improve on it. This makes dualism metaphysicality heavy and introduces more problems than it actually truly solves. Well, at the same time, I understand why substance dualism is appealing, as conscious experience feels fundamentally different from physical objects, being things like pain, emotions, and thoughts do not have or feel like they are electrical signals being sent, even if that's what science is telling us is how they are connected to the brain. I also think substance dualism uses an interesting approach, even if it is wrong, as it forces us to ask hard questions about what consciousness really is and whether physical explanations are complete. Without dualism, we might ignore the subjective side of experience altogether, forgetting about it and not realizing why it is truly important. Overall, substance dualism may not be the best theory of mind, but it remains an important starting point. It also helps frame debates about consciousness, identity, and the limits of scientific explanation. In the end, this topic of substance dualism poses questions that are still unsolved and unanswered today. And in the end, thank you for listening to my presentation. And yeah, that's all I got. Thank you.